So I'm redoing this video with some new commentary based on the great insight you guys have shared with me concerning why the African continent fell. The majority of this video will be the same as the last, but with one addition, so feel free to skip out on this one if you've already seen it. Anyway, if you guys recall in my previous video, I talked about my 4 gates theory as to why Africa fell, and now based on our collective minds coming together, I think we can now call it the 5 gates theory. So today, let's discuss the 5 pivotal reasons why the African continent fell. What up, African family? It's Home Team here, and I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And as always, if you want to support the Home Team, you can do so on patreon.com. I have some new rewards for you guys, so be sure to check that out. Also, go to afrographics.com, a website where you can find unique illustrative infographics summarizing African history. All links to Patreon, Afrographics, and Home Team merchandise are in the description box below. This video is not at all intended to be an absolute truth about the conditions that brought about our dark ages, but simply a foundation we can use to continue building off of. And thanks to you guys, I was able to add to the theory. We all know that empires around the globe rise and fall, but truly understanding the fall from grace of an entire continent is another issue altogether. We have the working theories and explanations from previous scholars concerning this topic, and we can use it as a model to build on. But the overarching theme, no matter the theory, seems to consistently tell us one story. The greatest assets of Africa was ironically the catalyst of its ultimate demise. Our theory is now called the 5 gates theory, and as mentioned before in my previous video, the reason for the gates idea is because gates can open and close. In the past, these 5 gates were opened, and that led to the downfall of the continent. But because we can identify these gates, we in the diaspora can now understand how to eventually close them. According to our new theory, the African continent met its demise because of 5 reasons: African diversity, desertification, globally desired natural resources, human error, and finally, religion. Our first gate is a natural occurrence. Unfortunately for the continent, because human beings originated from Africa, it naturally saw the rise of human diversity. Human beings on the continent of Africa are said to be the most genetically diverse group of people on the planet. Linguistically speaking, there are countless different languages spoken just in one region, let alone the entire continent. Believe it or not, the very first signs of ethnocentrism or even prejudice began in Africa. Even though we today admire African diversity, it became nearly impossible to unify all these groups of people into one homogeneous group. Because of African diversity, Africa failed to invent a Pan-African identity, even on a small regional scale, and therefore could not maintain large, long-lasting states. Thus, our first gate is African diversity. Now, the way in which we solve that issue as Afro-descended people is not by ignoring our diversity, but simply acknowledging and valuing the fact that we're all a related group of people. Our second gate is also natural. Some may view the fact that Africa has nearly all the resources humans need to thrive and survive as a good thing. We rant and rave about it a lot in the diaspora, but this was a good and bad thing at the same time. Simply because when you have nearly all the natural resources humans need to thrive and survive, you become the #1 target on the planet. Another factor of the natural resources was the fact that Africans were able to build civilization fairly quickly because of these resources, and their wealth grew because of this. Gold being a common item of interest in the ancient world, Africa became distinguished in the world for its legendary wealth, which led the Arabs to say, "Against the camel's mange use tar, and against poverty make a trip to the Sudan." Sudan for the Arabs meaning Africa below the Sahara. So as we can see, they were already targeting Africa in their oral literature. Arab and European writers spoke frequently about the wealth of Africa, and this narrative contributed in their desire to plunder. However, invading armies or even migrations of people outside of Africa were not just seeking the valuable resources from African soil, but even the civilization that was developed because of this wealth, Egypt being a prime example. One very valuable resource was unfortunately free human labor that essentially had all the genetic material available to survive virtually any environment, hot or cold. And it's largely because of our first gate of African diversity why it was so easy to manipulate and eventually depopulate entire regions in Africa during the Arab and Atlantic slave trades. This event left the continent bankrupt, as young, capable, healthy Africans were used for the cultural, intellectual, and economic advancement of other non-African nations. Thus, our second gate is valuable resources. Now, our third gate, at least to my knowledge, has not at all been explored in a way it should. This natural event was catastrophic, literally shifting the landscape of African civilization itself. What I'm talking about is the desertification of North Africa. North Africa essentially becoming a desert was a pretty devastating event for African people and African history, and for whatever reason, very few people seem to highlight this fact. We can just look at the wall paintings our ancestors left us, which clearly shows North Africa teeming with life and green pastures. Really imagine going from that to being faced with lack of food or resources in a matter of a few generations. The truth is, the Africans we see further south were once thriving in the North African regions we see today. This desertification led to the forced migrations and displacement of many African people. These mass migrations made it very easy for later foreign invaders to sweep through with little to no resistance. For example, the invasion of North Africa by the Arabs. African people had to make a rather quick transition from thriving to surviving due to these new conditions in North Africa, which I'm sure affected their culture. There are many cultures and people that we've yet to discover because the evidence is probably buried under the sand. Even cultures we know existed, like the Garamantes, are hard to understand because we know so little about them. And the desertification of North Africa is partly to blame. Losing elements of your culture, history, and even civilization is tough to deal with, especially when many of these cultures heavily relied on oral history to know and understand its origins. So our third gate is the desertification of North Africa. Now, our fourth gate is not necessarily the most devastating, but it certainly played a significant role in the condition of African people today. The fourth gate is human error, a very simple, naive one at that. This gate was that Africans assumed the nature or social disposition of others was the same or similar to their own. Now, this wasn't true for some African ethnic groups, but this was certainly true for the overwhelming majority of Africans on the continent. African men in particular seem to have this incessant need or even burden to uphold moral uprightness, and at times they seem to have a desire to maintain this even in the face of social or economic annihilation. They appear to have maintained it due to this assumption about the nature of non-Africans. Now, what evidence do we have to confirm this? Well, this topic in general can be expanded on in great detail, but for the sake of time, I'll give you guys 3 examples straight from African kings themselves, and keep in mind that these examples exemplify the very nature of African people. These 3 kings include Oba Awari the Great of Benin, King Pi of Kush, and King Mvema Nzinga of Congo. Let's start with Oba Awari of Benin. Oba Awari is considered the greatest king of the Benin Empire by many. Oddly enough, he is said to have predicted that Benin City would be burnt down in the future. This oddly specific prophecy from the king was strange enough, but ultimately he was right. 500 years later, Benin was consumed in flames as it was burnt down by the British. Now, whatever he actually meant by this prophecy doesn't really matter, but you would think that from his own prophecy, he would be hesitant to be so welcoming to foreigners. Well, that didn't deter him, and like the African kings you will see in these examples, he still decided to take the moral high ground. Oba Awari is quoted as saying, "Never make a stranger suffer, and whatever else you may do to a foreigner, you must not kill him. Forgive his transgressions, because he doesn't know the laws by which you live. Give him time and teach him the laws of your land." Now, of course, this is a nice principle to have, but via hindsight, we know that all foreigners on African soil were only interested in one thing. Unfortunately, there were transgressions that were forgiven by Benin, and they still were cautious in their approach to take preemptive action. Next, we have King Pi of Kush. Egypt during this time, from the Kushite perspective, was corrupted by foreign influence, and so the Kushite kings sought to restore Nile Valley culture, a culture they believe originated with them. Thus, the Kushites conquered Egypt, but they didn't destroy Egypt, they actually restored the culture and its many religious elements. Now, you would think that King Pi would kill the people he felt responsible for corrupting his beloved culture like any normal king. Actually, he did the exact opposite. He forgave his enemies and even gave them positions of power within the Kushite Empire. I mean, honestly, it doesn't get any more morally upright than that. And it wasn't just King Pi who did this. Other Kushite kings did the same thing. These Kushite kings exhibited the highest moral character by forgiving the people they claimed were destroying the very fabric of their identity. And our last one comes from King Mvemba Nzinga of Congo. This is probably the greatest example of African kings being more concerned with spiritual or moral uprightness than national security itself. King Mvemba converted to Christianity and was a genuine believer. He was said to be very enthusiastic about his newfound faith, and this of course excited the Portuguese because now they had a viable African king they could clearly manipulate. King Mvemba frequently wrote letters to King Manuel of Portugal. King Manuel, in attempts to butter up the African king, would often refer to King Mvemba in his letters as his royal brother. Ironically, King Mvemba was more spiritually Christian than the very people that converted him. He became increasingly disheartened and confused by the behavior of the Portuguese in his land and began to write many letters. The letter of King Mvemba Nzinga of Congo is such a great resource in understanding the nature of an African king. In a letter to King John III of Portugal, King Mvemba wrote him saying the following: "Each day the traitors are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers and no merchandise, unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom not be a place for the trade or transport of slaves." King Mvemba is also quoted as saying, "In this kingdom, faith is as fragile as glass because of the bad examples of the men who come to teach here, because the lusts of the world and lure of wealth have turned them away from the truth. Just as the Jews crucified the Son of God because of covetousness, my brother, so today he is again crucified." However, his protests were to no avail as the Portuguese king had no sympathy. Congo was only useful to him only as a source of slaves and revenue. He replied, "You tell me that you want no slave trading in your domains because this trade is depopulating your country. The Portuguese there, on the contrary, tell me how vast the Congo is and how it is so thickly populated that it seems as if no slave has ever left." So very clearly we see that King Mvemba was so trapped by his higher spiritual or moral standard that he couldn't even see that he was being manipulated by the disingenuous practices of the Portuguese. Now our last gate is very similar to the one that I previously mentioned, and that's the gate of religion. Now the religion aspect of this theory can be a very touchy subject. This is not to say that any new religion introduced into Africa from abroad is inherently bad. It's only to point out that for whatever reason, Africans who converted to foreign religions seem to have unwavering loyalty to the religion over concerns about national security. There are many examples of this, the Congo Empire being blinded by a false pretense of Christian brotherhood, with Portugal being one of them. But let's cover another African empire, the Songhai Empire. The Songhai Empire is considered by some to be the biggest empire in West Africa. Its downfall led to a very tumultuous time in the Western Sahel region. Like Congo, the Songhai seemed a little disillusioned with some false idea of religious brotherhood with their neighbors in the north. In truth, the Moroccans only viewed Songhai for the most part as a source of wealth. The fact that they were fellow Muslims didn't really matter at all. After the Moroccans defeated the Songhai at the Battle of Tondibi, some reports tell us that the people were protesting about being attacked by another Muslim nation. This report, if true, is very telling because it gives us insight into the moral attitudes of the people and their naive disposition. We in the diaspora must understand that no matter our religious beliefs, self-preservation cannot be neglected, and we have to learn from the errors of our ancestors. So what is the point of all this? What do we gain as Afro-descended people from learning this? While understanding what happened can help us shape the tools needed to build for our future, we must first be able to identify and acknowledge what went wrong so that we may garner the social, political, and economic capacity to remedy the issue. We can't look at this as a doom and gloom message. In fact, it's quite the opposite. That's why it's called the 5 gates theory. These gates have been open in the past, but now we have the knowledge to close them. The African continent and its descendants around the globe have inherited such a unique opportunity to make the most glorious comeback in human history. We have nowhere to go but up. But anyway, guys, please share your thoughts below, and if you'd like to support the home team, you can do so on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.